morning, everyone. Thanks for coming this morning. I'm speaking to you today as the former VP of People at Thumbtack with full permission from Thumbtack. I do work as the GM of Uber Eats right now, but today I'm speaking to you on behalf of Thumbtack. I'd love to do a little warm-up activity together. If you've got a piece of paper in front of you, I just want you to quickly jot down 2 of the highest highs of your entire life and 2 of the lowest lows. Just those moments that come to mind where you felt unbelievably good and really pretty bad. And then once you've written those down, what I want you to do is think about what advice would you give to yourself based on those moments. So just take a second to do that. Think about it if you don't have a piece of paper. Then what I want you to do is try and distill that advice or those lessons that you've learned just down to a few words. And what this is going to be is the beginning of the draft of your personal values. I encourage you to finish this another time. It'll probably take you a few goes. Just an example from me. I can't decide if it was a real high or a real low, but it was certainly a turning point for me when I decided to leave my medical career and join a startup to run their operations. And that turned out to be a really pivotal point in my life. And what it represents for me is my core value of just say yes. So that's an example for me. What I'd love you to do is turn to the person next to you and just share one of those moments that you've come up with, a high or a low, and the value that's starting to emerge from that. So just give you a minute to do that. Turn to the person next to you. So now, I'd like you to imagine one other scenario, okay? Imagine that you've just spent another day in back-to-back interviews talking to senior software engineering candidates. You're trying to grow your 20-person engineering team, which is the absolute core engine of your company's growth. And you've met a lot of candidates. Comes down to these 2 guys. They are both brilliant, technically brilliant, CVs to die for. They are personable and articulate in the interview. How do you make a decision? I mean, the truth is they're engineers. You should just hire anyone you can get. But the point is, at Thumbtack, it was absolutely critical that we looked at who was going to be a really strong ambassador of the company values for us, particularly with senior hires. And that ultimately came down to how do you make a decision when if you only got money to hire one. Absolutely critical to think about how will they champion the values that are so important to your company. So I'm going to take you through Thumbtack's journey today to define and bring to life their company values. I joined Thumbtack as about their 25th employee or so in 2013, and I left in the middle of last year to move back to Melbourne. During my time there, the company grew from 25 to 500 employees and to a $1.3 billion marketplace. So you can imagine sort of the pace of growth of the business and the team during that time. And being really clear about who we were as a team and what we fiercely wanted to protect was one of the most important ingredients to successful company growth. When I started at Thumbtack, there was an early version of the company values that the founders had written down a couple of years before, and those served us reasonably well until we sort of hit about 100 employees. Prior to that, every founder was able to interview every candidate coming in the door. And so it was time for a refresh, and I was asked to lead that process for the company. The following year, I became the VP of People at Thumbtack. I had been the Director of Customer Operations prior to that. And my role as VP of People, I saw as really protecting the company values and bringing them to life for the business. So what are values in a company context? The dictionary says they're principles or standards of behaviour, one's judgment of what's important in life. I actually think that's a pretty good definition in a company context too. They should define the values and behaviours that are important to the company, the core principles that give meaning to your work, a set of standards that help guide your team's behaviours. Just a quick note to differentiate brand values from company values, because I think these are different and I think they're often confused. So brand values describe how you want your customers to feel when they use your product. Jeff Bezos famously says they're what your customers say about you when you're not in the room. I really like that. And Thumbtack's brand values, just to give you a sense, include words like dependable, approachable, and empowering. These are not the same as the internal core company values. So today I'm talking to you about internal core company values, non-customer facing values. When you define who you are as a team and you put these together with a bunch of rituals, to me, that's what makes company culture. And company culture happens whether you like it or not, whether you define it or not. If you don't clearly define and embed it, then it can turn into something that you really didn't intend. And that's why I believe it's so important to take the time to define your values and create meaningful rituals to support them. Lots of great companies do this. Thumbtack did not invent this. Google is really famous for their do good, not evil value. And Uber, where I work now, has a very thoughtful, though very closely guarded set of values. There's 14 of them. An example is celebrate cities. That's one of Uber's company values. And that comes to life by having hyper-local city teams to celebrate cities in the 500 plus cities where that company is. So I'm grateful to Thumbtack's founders for allowing me to share this story, even though I don't work there anymore. I'll start by sharing the 4 values that we ended up with, and then I'm going to talk you through what I think were the 4 most important elements to getting to that point. A bit of a how-to. So the first one was know our customer. This at Thumbtack came from 2 places, both a data-driven approach and a deep emotional empathy for the people that you're serving. No matter how well you execute, if you don't do what's right for your customers, it doesn't really matter. So that's where this value came from. Reason from first principles. This is a sort of deeply important part of Thumbtack's personality and way of doing business, and it's about approaching each problem with a fresh lens, with a creative lens, and always asking and then explaining the why to people in the company. It's the opposite of just the cookie cutter approach that you learnt at your last company, considering the context and making sure that what you're doing is right for that moment. Make each other better. So this is about locking arms and climbing the mountain together. It's about giving and receiving candid feedback and making sure that you're aware of what people around you need. There can be a tendency to be, what do I need? How do I get better? And this very intentionally pointed people outwardly to the people around them and next to them so that we were helping each other improve. And finally, go. So this talks to the sense of urgency and intensity that you feel when you're in Thumbtack's offices. And the point behind it is that it's a reminder of the fact that Thumbtack dreams really big and is motivated to make a massive impact. And if we don't move fast, then it's really hard to accomplish all of the things that the company sets out to do. So those 4 together were the output of what I'm going to walk you through in the rest of the talk. When you put the values together, they're a really strong representation of Thumbtack's DNA. And amongst the tens of things that we thought about putting on the list, these were the 4 values that the founders really, really wanted to fiercely protect. They were absolutely certain that cultivating these as Thumbtack grew would make, continue to make great what had started the company so successfully. So I believe there were 4 critical ingredients to actually getting to this point at Thumbtack. Founder buy-in, going through the actual process of defining or refreshing the values, the launch, and then the work that continues, which is embedding these values in the company and actually bringing them to life on a daily basis. So let's talk about founder buy-in. So this is a quote from Marco, the CEO of Thumbtack, talking to a journalist in the States. And he says, our 4 values are the most important thing. They're what guide and orient us and define us as an organisation. And he goes on in that interview to describe each value in detail. Well, what's important about this? There are 2 things. One is he elevates the values whenever he has a chance, inside and outside the company. There's so many interesting things that he could talk about in an interview, but he chooses to talk about the values. He champions them whenever he can. And the second thing is he knows what they are. They're as natural to him to talk about as top-line business metrics. And I really appreciated that. Without Marco, Jonathan, Sandra, and the whole leadership team's deep buy-in for this process and the output, I don't think that we would have been able to achieve the level of enthusiasm and commitment to the values that we actually ended up with. So the second critical ingredient is when you actually go through the process of either defining for the first time or, in this case, refreshing the values that we had. There's a lot of work to be done to distill what the right values are, and there's lots of ways to do it. This is one. So before we embarked on the process, I spoke to a bunch of companies that had been through this process and first came up with a set of principles that were going to be really important for Thumbtack. I recommend, these if they're right for your company. So for us, being pithy, this is one of Marco's favourite words, means using few and powerful words, and a deliberate choice at Thumbtack to keep the list short and memorable. So they were very, very set on 4 values. Could have easily had 10 to 15. It was 4. Be pithy. Choose values that are largely true of the team that already exists there today. I think this is a really important one. You could write a long list of aspirational values, but if no one in the building, particularly the founders, looks or feels like that today, you're probably not going to succeed. So it should feel very much like already what's there. It's just surfacing that and articulating it. For us, at the time that we did this, we had an office in San Francisco, we had an office in Salt Lake City, very different culture to San Francisco at its core, and then we had hundreds of contractors in the Philippines. And it was really important that we had a core set of values that made sense across geographies. Now, it's very common and absolutely acceptable that the rituals that go along with those values are different in each place, but the core values have to be consistent, otherwise it's very confusing. And they should help guide decisions and together feel like Thumbtack. So at Thumbtack I used both a top-down and a bottoms-up approach, and so that meant that I used, these are the founders, their original set of values as a starting point, and I let the founders have control over the final list and the wording, the exact wording. I also heavily engaged the rest of the business to surface what they felt defined Thumbtack. We had 10 workshops across the business, and we covered probably about 60% of the people at the company attended one of those workshops. It was opt-in. And the format for the workshops included facilitated activities, nothing fancy, a bunch of posters, markers and post-its, but facilitated conversations as well as open discussion and questions. We went through 8 drafts of the values over 6 months to end up with the 4 that I showed you today. And I think the message from that is don't underestimate the amount of effort and time and the number of iterations that we put into this. And I know that other companies did the same. I think it's well worth it to get it right. So with all the hard work and wordsmithing behind you once you've gone through this is when the fun begins. So after so many drafts and discussions, there was a lot of anticipation in the business to see the final version. It was important that we launched with a bit of fanfare and some meaningful new rituals to support the values. So we announced the values as part of our quarterly kickoff party, which at Thumbtack is a big deal every quarter. There's pretty fancy slides and audio visuals. People fly in from the Philippines and from Salt Lake to celebrate, and so it's an appropriate venue and occasion to make a big deal of something that we thought was really important. At the same quarterly kickoff, we launched a new award called the Dent Makers Award, and this award was specifically built around the new 4 values that we were launching. So nominations for the award have to fall under at least one of the 4 values, and the bar to win an award is actually very high, and so we don't have to pick a winner every quarter. Right? You have to meet a standard that says the impact that you made is business changing and it's enduring. And so this picture represents the first ever Dent Maker Award that was given to the Thumbtack Labs team under the value of Go. And so they've all got golden shoes on their desk. We also had values cards printed and given out to every single employee's desk as a visual reminder. We had a large decal too at the top of the stairs in a very prominent place when you came into the building. But after the announcement and the parties and the trophies, it's really important that this doesn't just become stickers on a wall. And it's pretty easy at this point for that to happen. The fanfare's over, the wordsmithing's over, and it just dies. So to me, this is actually the most important step, and it's ongoing. It really never ends. So during the months following the values launch, we got to work really weaving the values into all sorts of key decisions, regular processes, and physical space. And I think these are most of the key areas that you need to think about when you're embedding. And there's lots of sort of sub-activities that you can do in each one. But for us, it was how do we represent the values in hiring, onboarding and training, promotions, feedback and reviews, recognition and reward, and the physical environment. And just some examples for you. So we wrote the values interview questions to align with the new values. And so what we had was sort of a 1 or 2 pager that describes each value. It lists 2 questions that an interviewer should ask about that value. And structured interviewing is another topic that I'm passionate about. But the point is to stick to the same questions and ask them over and over again so you can easily compare candidates. And then a sense of sort of what a good answer looks like is also on that piece of paper. Every candidate that comes through the company has to have a values fit interview, and particularly for senior leadership positions, we will not hire at Thumbtack if you're not a strong not a cultural fit, a strong ambassador of the values. Another example was the values cards, and then this is just a screenshot of how we started to weave this into our performance discussions. So we were defining expectations at different levels of the business. So this is just two levels. And what it looks like when you sort of meet the expectations of behaving and making decisions according to that value. And this is an ongoing process. This is V1. It's very hard. So again, a whole other conversation I could have about this, but just an example of some of the ways that we started to bring this to life and to give you a sense of it's a lot of effort. People need to be doing this all the time and taking it very seriously. So now what? So you're obviously interested enough in the topic that you thought you'd come along today, but not everybody's in a company that's at a stage that's ripe to do exactly this process that I've described to you. What I want you to think about is that there's really lots of ways that you can incorporate this concept into your journey or your company's journey, no matter where you're at. If you're looking for a new role right now, when you're interviewing, make sure you ask the interviewer, what are your company values? How do those come to life in this place? And it'll give you a really strong sense of, do I share these values? Is this somewhere that I'm excited to come to work every day? If you are in a more mature company or one where there isn't buy-in from the top to do this, start with your team or start with your function. This is a really great exercise no matter the scale. And finally, if you feel like there's an existing set of values or the whole process just feels really too big and too hard and you're not resourced well enough, just start with one draft that you use in hiring. Because if you get it right at the front, it will help you go through that full process later. For Thumbtack, the values really became the most important guide in the business for team growth. Every day, the values play a part in what makes Thumbtack an absolutely fantastic business and ultimately a great place to work. Questions?
Thank you. Thank you.
It's very interesting to hear, your take on all of this. My question goes, I suppose it's like almost like stress testing the values. Do you ever find, you can have some very nice developmental phases with this sort of thing, but do you ever find that one of the values after a while, once you repeat it, you're kind of like, well, this actually kind of isn't really suited? It might sound nice and it might sort of feel nice, but it actually... Do you ever sort of notice that with the process?
So These had been live for about almost 2 years by the time I left, not quite, 18 months. And when we went through the exercise, we were pretty clear that we wanted them to be relevant for kind of 3 to 5 years. I think one thing that you speak to is, as the company evolves, you might find that some of the values that you've written no longer feel relevant. And so I don't think this is forever. I think you refresh it, and if that happens, go back and do another refresh. We didn't sort of acutely have that problem in the time frame that I was there. They felt very right and very relevant for the stage of the business. I will say something that was interesting was we did have a tension between two specific values, which was the reason from first principles and the go. So if you love reasoning from first principles, you can literally pontificate and debate all day long, and you can use that almost as an excuse to do that, and then there's not enough go. So it was okay that we had values that were in tension. They had a name to them, and people could say, you know, these are both important to us, so we need a bit of this and we need a bit of this. We can't be too extreme on one or the other. And actually Amazon does a great job of this. When they define they call them their leadership principles, they actually have a definition of what is too much and what is too little of a value. And I loved that, because I think there is such a thing as too much. But I mean, to your original question, yes, I think you constantly need to think about, do these continue to be relevant for the business? And if they don't, you should change them. You shouldn't stick to them just because you wrote them down.
What was your medical background? And the second one, did you have everyone commit to it in the organization, or did you have people that were quite resistant?
Great question. So my medical background was emergency medicine. Everybody asks me why I left and how that's relevant. And the two things that I say is triage is extremely useful in a startup context. And so is hypothesis-driven problem solving. Because in medicine, anytime you do a test on a patient, you stick them with a needle or you expose them to radiation. So you can't just boil the ocean and do everything. You have to be really targeted about what you think the answer is and then how you prove that. And I've carried that with me. Bain's actually also very strong on that. And it's answer first thinking. Jade will know about this. So that's the medical side. Did we get buy-in from everyone in the organisation? So conceptually, yes, everybody loved the idea of having values and having something to sort of help guide their behaviour and help guide their decision-making. When the actual values came out, I'd say the most controversial one was go, because I think at more junior levels of the organisation, sometimes people felt like it was used to sort of create pressure to work hard, which was not the intent of the value. And so I think that was the least popular and probably still is. We did have an engagement survey there that was done twice, 2 to 3 times a year, and we very specifically asked, do you know what this value is? Do you believe that it's relevant? And how do you think we're doing on living out this value? And there were so many new people coming in because of the fast growth of the company that those results changed depending on, you know, how fresh the cohort was. And I'd say the hardest people to convince are the people that have been there the longest, because they really hold on to what it was like at the very beginning. And if there's something in there that didn't feel like the old days, then that sometimes made people unhappy. But I would say largely these were celebrated and championed by, you know, all levels of the organisation.
Hi, Jodie. Thanks for sharing. It's interesting that you mentioned they went through like 10 workshops and so many different activities to then narrow it down to 4 values. So in your opinions, how critical you think it is for companies when they just start out to define their values early on, so that when they grow to like 200, 500 employees, they don't have to go through that exercise?
I think you can do it from day one when you're just the founders. But I think that you always need to revisit. I think it's helpful to do it with a few people in the room and it's pretty quick and easy. But once you get to sort of 50 to 100, I think it's a really important time to take stock and look around and say, have we built a company that's true to what we originally thought was important? Or do we need to sort of refresh those? And what the founders had written down originally was actually pretty good. It was just not that clear, and it was a mix of mission, vision and values. And so taking that as a foundation and then saying, okay, let's separate out mission and vision and actually really articulate what the values are, was what was helpful at that next stage. And I imagine in a couple of years they'll do the same thing again, just to check You know, is this what people feel is important?